Welcome back to the Takacs McGinnis Elder Care News Hour. I'm Barbara McGinnis, and in today's episode, we're talking about estate planning and unique circumstances for certain demographics.
Hi, and I'm Tim Takacs, and in this segment, we're going to talk about estate planning as it relates to women. Women often retire earlier, many cases to retire to care for elderly family members. Women typically outlive their husbands and often spend many years alone. So with us today, and to give the financial planner's perspective, is Jana Lisle Parham. Jana is a certified financial planner and Senior Vice President of Lisle Parham Wealth Management in Nashville. Welcome, Jana.
Thank you for having me.
So how do estate planning needs differ from those of men?
Well, as you can imagine, a lot of the estate planning needs are the same. As you mentioned, women do tend to live longer. So 40% of women over the age of 65 live alone, either by choice or by chance. Women, according to census data, outlive men by about 5 years. And the average life expectancy today of a woman is 81. And, you know, that's a statistic, but you have to stop then and think that means 50% of women live beyond the age of 81. It becomes a little more real world then. So as women think about estate planning, I think one of the most important things and the most different things for them is there's a high likelihood, regardless of their involvement earlier in their lifespan with their partner, that they will be solely in charge of their financial world and their estate planning needs at some point.
So those statistics that you've given us, about 40% of those over 65 live alone. And so
that's right, of women over 65.
And that's a large group of people.
Absolutely.
So uniquely, they need to plan differently than if they were still a couple, because like we were saying earlier, the surrogate decision making and becoming financially astute, right?
That's right.
And that's what you help them do.
And one of the things that is kind of beneath the surface there is that with all financial planning, you're trying to plan not just for today, but for the future. And the future rarely looks like it does today. It doesn't look like it financially. It doesn't look like it in terms of how many people are in the household. And so it's very important that women become educated, regardless of their desire to be involved at this stage with estate planning.
Okay, I'm going to ask something. Just what about, because women historically, especially older women now, are probably have been lower earners than perhaps their spouse, right?
Absolutely.
That has to have an impact then on how they make their money stretch.
It does, and you know, I think that's changing over time, but the fact is that women traditionally have been the ones to stay home, raise a family, and now more and more women are the caregivers of their parents or their in-laws, and so women do spend more time in the home. So they're going to have less assets that they've built up in their name in terms of retirement accounts, and their job skills are not as up to date traditionally. So it is extra important, I think, for women to plan in terms of estate planning. You know, just thinking about things like, what if my working spouse, if I'm the one at home doing the caregiving, passes away before retirement? You know, what does that financial planning look like? And part of financial planning is to examine a lot of different scenarios so you can plan for the hoped inevitability of long lives for both of you, but also the fact that if the gentleman or the woman should pass away during the working years, that you have a recourse.
So let's say that a client comes to you, she's 68 years old, and her husband, who is 70, suddenly died. You know, and let's say that, like probably a lot of couples, they were thinking they were going to live a long and happy life and retire in the south of France, or maybe in Jamestown, Tennessee, or someplace in between. Now what? You know, what is that spouse, that woman, who thought she had basically had everything taken care of? What are you going to recommend to her? Well,
you know, so let's start first with the ideal scenario, and that is that long ago, the woman and the man engaged in financial planning and estate planning that would provide for this situation. All of us know that it's absolutely the worst time and situation in the world for someone to begin getting engaged and begin getting educated in financial planning while they're in the midst of mourning a loved one. And if there's one thing I can encourage women to do, it's to really take that approach that we are partners in this, and we have to have a partnership in terms of determining our estate plans. But that is the case at times, that women come in and they are recently bereaved and they don't know what to do. In that case, we would take a step back. We would look at all the estate planning documents with them. We would examine all the beneficiary forms that they have, and then we would embark on a lot of education, because trust is involved here, and that comes with time, but people have to be willing to educate people, and I would encourage those women to ask questions.
So it sounds like really it's about, I guess in healthcare it's sometimes referred to as self-management support. Is you as the financial planner for, maybe as you say, a widow who is recently widowed, is to educate them so that they can manage their own affairs day to day.
That's right, and just recognizing that their preferences may not be the preferences that their husband had or they indeed had as a couple. Just helping them get to that place where they realize that really the choices are theirs, and that can be a good thing as well as a scary thing.
Now here's what I think is the worst case scenario. What if the spouse that comes in is a disabled or incapacitated spouse?
Exactly.
And they're recently widowed.
And that brings us to a very important point, I think, for women, and that is, if it is likely that the woman is going to outlive the male spouse, then when you go to do your powers of attorney, which you mentioned earlier, powers of attorney for health care, powers of attorney for financial, you name your spouse typically as your first power of attorney. What about that next person in line? That is an incredibly likely scenario, and particularly for a disabled person, right? I think it's important, as well as we're talking about the disability, for likely those assets might be in trust at that point, and just having an understanding of what that means. But naming that secondary power of attorney, I think, is important.
Well, in the very beginning of this episode, when Tim was asking me about mistakes or oversights, and that's really a frequent one that we see, where
it absolutely
spouses name each other and then there's not a backup plan for decision making, or they've not thought through that and they've just named a child, and then they've not involved the children, and so they inherit now decision making capacity for a parent, but they're not prepared to do it because they've not been involved.
You bring up a great point. We work a lot with generations of families, and communication about things prior to having to step into those roles is so critical.
And we all like to think that those bad things aren't going to happen to us, not going to happen to our family. Unfortunately, they happen frequently to us.
Right.
And being prepared, being proactive, lets us stay in control. I know I'm preaching to the choir a little bit, but it's still something that I love to say and get out there.
It's one of the best things I think parents can do for their children, is to have that conversation. I think we have a publication called Investor Watch, and one of the things that in this recent survey it found is that in the parental and adult-child relationships, everybody expects the parent to be the one to bring it up. Even the adult children would rather that happen. So I think that's a huge gift you can bring to your children.
Jana, there's one thing that we haven't talked about yet is about, and something that we're seeing a lot now in our practice, is what we call the unsupported elder. The older person, and maybe say in this, since we're talking about women, say a widowed 75 years old and maybe has no family, no children, or if they're estranged, or what advice do you give to women in those situations?
Well, it is the whole aging process, as you know, is a big one, and one that former generations just aren't equipped to deal with. They haven't experienced it to the extent that we are now. It's highly likely that if a woman outlives the male, that there's going to either be cognitive or physical disability at some point. So looking into long-term care insurance, or at least having the financial plan developed enough where you're certain whether you can self-insure. Men often have the benefit of having the caregiving done by the wife, and so there's that family network of support that, as you mentioned, women may not have. I've had women want to look into long-term care simply because they don't want their children to feel the need to have to help mom out.
Good point.
All right.
I think we have contact information for Lisle Parham Wealth Management on the screen right now. I want to thank Jana for being here today.
All right, so it's time for another break. When we come back, we'll continue our focus on estate planning for women with a look at the implications of divorce. Coming up, Women in Divorce. Stay with us.